بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب زدني علما.
Okay, the next thing we'll talk about the dynamic NAT. We'll see the configuration of the dynamic NAT. And again, the prerequisite of this lab is again the same thing. What I did is I just removed the NAT configurations of the static NAT what we did in our previous lab. So if you verify show run as well, you don't see any translation. So I also removed the NAT inside outside commands based on the previous lab. So we will be removing the static NAT and then we'll be reconfiguring the same requirement with the dynamic NAT. Like here the requirement is, like if you remember we discussed the dynamic NAT allows you to translate one-to-one mapping, but this one-to-one mapping is done dynamically. So only thing we need to define is we need to define the range of private IP address. Like in my example, I have a complete subnet, let's say 192.168.1.subnet, and assume there are around, let's say 200 addresses, 200 IPs or 200 users. And this all should get translated to any IP within this range. Let's say 50.111 to 50.1.1.255 range. So of course, 0 and the last one, it will not be used. So up to 254. These are the addresses should be used. So it's not possible to define that many addresses. So what we'll be doing is we just tell to select the dynamically from this range of private addresses to this range of public addresses we want to translate. Now configuration wise, we need to define, the configuration goes in 3 steps. The first step, we need to define what is your private IP range. Probably we'll be defining that. And in the second step, we'll be defining what is the public IP range. And then finally, we are going to map the private IP to public IP. So 3-step configuration. So let's come with the first step. So in the first step, we need to define the private IP range. And the private IP range we will be defining with the help of ACL, standard ACL. So what we need to do is we need to use a standard ACL and then we need to use any ACL number in between 1 to 99. And then we need to say permit. Permit in the sense here we want to translate. So whatever the networks which are matching the permit statement, because I'll be using this ACL in the NAT. Like if you remember, we have discussed the ACL section. ACL is going to set a set of rules which is going to match the traffic. And depending upon that match, I can use them to either permit or deny when the traffic is moving through the interface. Like when you apply on F0 by 0 interface, it will either deny or permit the traffic as it goes through that interface. So I can also use an ACL in the NAT. It's going to say that when I use them in the NAT, it's going to define whether you want to translate or not. So whatever the networks matching the permit statement will translate them, and whatever defined in the deny, it will not translate. So depending upon the ACL where we are using, so we'll be using ACLs in many other scenarios, like in the route filtering, in the BGP options. So here we'll be using the ACL, and this ACL 55 represents or match my complete 192.168.1.subnet. So when I'm writing 192.168.1.0 with this wildcard mask means it's going to permit or match all the networks whichever starts with 192.168.1. And the statement permit says that we need to translate all the addresses which are starting with 192.168.1. So let's say if you have more networks, let's say if you have more networks, you can write another statement saying that 192.168.2.0 with a wildcard mask of 0000255. Okay, so you can add multiple networks, but make sure that you are using the same ACL number in general. So the first step, we need to define the private IP range, and that is done with the help of an ACL. Now the next thing is we need to define the public IP range. Now in this public IP range, to define that, this is how the syntax goes. So we have to say IP NAT pool, any some name for the pool, let's say public IP, some name. And then we need to define what is the starting public IP. Because typically the range, when you select the range or get the public IP range from the service provider, it will be in the form of subnets. So basically it will be continuation in a specific range based on subnetting. So in my example, let's say the starting public IP is 5111. And let's say the ending public IP, we need to specify, let's say 50.1.1.254 or 200, whatever the, let's say I'm using up to 200 here. So we can use any of this range. And then we need to say net mask. Net mask is a part of the command. And the subnet mask, if I'm using /24, I have to say 255.255.255.0. Now, depending upon the subnet, what you get, you will get the slash value or the subnet mask. You need to specify that after the net mask command. So the same thing here. I'm using the pool name as CCNA here. And then I'm defining the starting public IP. And then the ending public IP. And then the subnet mask depending upon the network range what I'm using here. Now the last thing is we need to do the mapping. So the third step is we need to do mapping. So in the mapping we need to map this private address range, which means the ACL number should be mapped with this one. So we need to say that, okay, if any network comes within this private IP range, within this ACL, that should get translated with the public IP, whatever is defined inside the pool. So we do this way. We need to say IP NAT inside source list, and then the ACL number. ACL number you need to specify whatever you are using. If you're using named ACL, we can use name as well. And then the pool name, whatever the pool name I have used here. So in my example, I have used the pool name as CCNA. So we need to say IP NAT inside source list. List means ACL access list. That's what we are going to say. And then we need to say pool and the name of the pool here. Okay, so it's a complete 3-line configuration. So the first step, we need to define the private IP range. In the second step, we need to define the public IP pool. And in the third line, we need to do mapping of the private IP to the public IP address, whatever it defined. And then the implementation is still the same. So the implementation, as we did in the static NAT, we need to define from where you get your private IPs and the interface, and this is going to be inside. Mostly the interface facing towards the LAN from where you get all the private IPs host. And the interface which is connecting to the service portal will be my outside interface. So if you define the wrong direction, again, that's not going to work. So make sure that you are defining the correct directions or the correct NAT configurations on a specific interfaces. Okay, so this is a configuration overview here. Now the next thing, we'll go and configure this. Again, the prerequisite the same as we did for the static NAT. So make sure that we do have an IP addressing configured here. And also we do have a routing. We have seen that prerequisite. So the same prerequisite. So I have already removed the static routing, what I did in the previous topics. Okay, so there is no NAT configured right now, so it's been removed. Okay, so let's go and configure as per this. So I'm going to write an access list. You can also use named ACL. So if you want to use IP access list standard, let's say the named ACL is private IP, and then we can say permit 192.168.1.subnet, and then the wildcard mask. Okay, and then the next step is we need to define the public IP range, right? That's what we have seen here. So I'm going to specify the public IP range, IP NAT pool, and any name for the pool. Let's say the name of the pool is pub IP, let's say, and the starting public IP is 5111, and the ending public IP I'm using, let's say, 500. So you can always use question mark and the net mask and the subnet mask, whatever the range. And then finally, we need to map these two addresses, and further we need to say IP NAT inside source list. And the list, either I can use the name of the number of the ACL or the name. So here I have used the name, so I'll be using this, the same private IP, and that should get translated to pool. And what is the name of the pool? And the name of the pool is this one, public IP. Done. Now once we do this configuration, the final step is we need to go to the E0x0 interface, it's an IP NAT inside, and S0x0 interface, it's my outside according to my diagram, inside and outside interfaces.